The story of Noah's flood. You've probably heard it a million times, right? A good man, a giant boat, and a world washed clean. For centuries, people have debated it. Is it a story of faith? A scientific impossibility? Well, what if there's another way to look at it? Today, we're going to take a completely fresh look at this ancient story, guided by the really deep research of Catholic author Dave Armstrong from a fantastic chapter in his book, The Word Set in Stone. Okay, let's dive in.
The language in Genesis is absolute. This wasn't just some bad weather. This was presented as an act of decreation, a total reset button on a world that had gone completely off the rails.
Here's the big question that Armstrong tackles. When the Bible talks about destroying the earth, does that mean a global flood, with water literally covering Mount Everest, or could it mean something different? Armstrong digs into the evidence for a massive but local flood, an event so huge that for the people who lived through it, it absolutely would have seemed like their entire world was ending. So, to see how he builds this case, we're going to follow Armstrong's investigation through 6 key areas. We're going to start with the language of the Bible itself, which might not mean what you think. Then we'll look for a specific time and place using some surprising archaeology. We'll tackle the engineering puzzle of the Ark, the problem of how water could stick around for a year, where the Ark actually landed, and finally, we'll look at a modern flood that might just change how you see the whole thing. First up, a flood of questions. See, before we can even get into the geology or the engineering, Armstrong argues we have to go back to the words themselves. Re-examining how ancient people actually wrote and spoke is the foundation for this whole investigation, and it's a pretty fascinating place to start. Armstrong makes a really crucial point about how ancient people described their world. They used what you might call phenomenological language. They described things as they appeared to them. So, for instance, Genesis says all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain. Now, does that literally mean people from China or the Americas showed up? No, of course not. It means all the nations they knew about. And as Armstrong points out, this way of speaking is super common in ancient literature. And this quote from the theologian Bernard Ram just nails it. Think about it. If you're Noah, you're on a boat in the middle of this vast, flat Mesopotamian plain, and for as far as you can see in every single direction, there is nothing but water. Well, for you, the entire world is flooded. The universality is about what you experience, not what a satellite would see. Okay, so if we accept that the language might be describing a massive local event from a human point of view, the next question is obvious. Where and when did it happen? This brings us to part 2, where Armstrong shows us the archaeological evidence that points to a surprisingly specific time and a very real place. Armstrong zooms in on ancient Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq. And this is where he starts connecting some fascinating dots between the Bible and other ancient texts, like the Sumerian king list. This ancient document talks about 10 kings who ruled before a great flood, right around 2900 BC. So, get this. When archaeologists were digging at the site of ancient Shuruppak, they found something incredible. Right at the geological layer that dates to around 2900 BC, they hit a solid, uniform layer of clean clay that had clearly been deposited by water. It was a flood deposit, and it was 2 feet thick. This was actual physical evidence of a massive flood that destroyed a city, right where and when the ancient records suggest it happened. Now we get to one of the biggest challenges for the whole story, the Ark itself. This brings us to part 3, the Ark's impossible size. And it's a serious engineering puzzle, a big reason why a lot of people just dismiss the story right away. The Bible gives us the dimensions for the Ark, which work out to be about 450 feet long. Naval engineers will tell you that building a wooden ship much longer than 300 feet is, well, it's next to impossible. Even the biggest wooden ships ever built, in modern times with steel reinforcements, they still leaked and had major structural issues. So how on earth could an ancient boat that big hold together? Well, it really comes down to basic physics. A long wooden ship out on the water is under enormous stress. When a wave lifts up the middle, the ends droop down. That's called sagging. When waves lift the ends, the middle bends up. That's hogging. This constant flexing and bending would pop the seams between the planks, and the ship would basically tear itself apart. A 450-foot wooden boat just shouldn't work. So, is the story sunk? Well, not so fast. What if the problem isn't the physics, but the math? The Sumerians, who first recorded these flood stories, didn't use our base 10 counting system. They used a base 60 system. We actually still use it to tell time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and for circles. The original dimensions might have been in that system, and when later scribes copied it into our familiar base 10 system, they might have made a simple conversion error. This doesn't just solve an engineering problem. It suggests the Bible might be preserving a really ancient mathematical detail that we're just not reading correctly.
Okay, so we've got a plausible time and place, and maybe even a solution for the ark's size. But that leads to another huge scientific question. How could a local flood possibly last for nearly a year without just draining away? This is part 4, the hydrology problem of the lingering water. A whole year is a really long time for floodwaters to stick around. But Mesopotamia is kind of uniquely perfect for exactly this kind of disaster. It wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of 4 things happening at once. 1, incredibly intense rain for a long time. 2, massive snowmelt from the nearby mountains, flooding the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. 3, Genesis mentions the fountains of the deep, the region's natural springs bursting open under pressure. And 4, a huge storm surge coming in from the Persian Gulf, basically corking the bottle and preventing any water from getting out. And this is where the local geography just becomes the star of the show. Once all that water pours into the Mesopotamian basin, where does it go? Well, almost nowhere. The region is unbelievably flat. I mean, the land only drops about 300 feet over a 400-mile stretch. That's a grade of just 0.01%. With a storm surge blocking the exit and rivers and springs still pumping water in, the drainage would be painfully slow. It would take months and months to recede, which, what do you know, lines up perfectly with the timeline in Genesis.
All right, let's follow the journey to its end and see where the ark finally came to a stop. This takes us to Section 5, Journey to the Mountains, and it's another part of the story with its own famous geographical puzzle.
Now, we all have this image of the ark landing on the icy 17,000-foot peak of Mount Ararat in Turkey. But Armstrong points out that the Bible is really specific here. It doesn't say Mount Ararat, it says the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And Ararat, or Urartu, wasn't a single mountain. It was the ancient name for a whole province, a whole region, basically the highlands that form the northern border of that flat Mesopotamian plain. It's a small difference in wording, but it changes everything.
For over 1,000 years, both Christian and Islamic traditions actually identified the landing site as a smaller peak called Jebel Judi. And check out how perfectly this fits the story Armstrong is laying out. It's located right in the mountains of Ararat region. It's at a much more believable 6,800 feet. It sits right at the edge of the Mesopotamian plain, exactly where a boat would likely run aground as the water slowly went down. And crucially, its climate can support olive trees and vineyards, which is precisely what Noah finds and plants right after he gets off the ark. So, we've looked at the language, the archaeology, the geography. It all paints a very plausible picture. But the final question is, could a flood of this scale really happen in the real world? This brings us to our final section, historical parallel. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. You know, we think of the 40 days and 40 nights of rain in the Bible as this unbelievably long time. But the rains that caused the 1927 flood, they lasted on and off from August of 1926 all the way to April of 1927. That's over 240 days, 6 times longer than the downpour described in Genesis.
And when you really look at the details here, the similarities are just uncanny. The Mississippi Basin, just like Mesopotamia, is an incredibly flat floodplain surrounded by higher ground, and it drains into a gulf. In 1927, the river swelled to 80 miles wide in some spots. It created an inland sea that covered 27,000 square miles, and the water took over a year to fully go away. As Armstrong argues, this isn't some theory. It's a documented, historical example of a flood with a similar scale, duration, and topography to the one in Genesis. It can happen. It has happened.
So, let's wrap this all up. When you look at the biblical language the way an ancient person would, when you pinpoint a time and place with archaeology, when you think differently about ancient math, and you really understand the unique geography of the region, the story of Noah's flood transforms. It becomes a totally plausible account of a real, world-changing, catastrophic local flood in ancient Mesopotamia. And that leaves us right here, with the question Armstrong himself asks at the end of his chapter. After looking at all this evidence, from ancient texts to modern floods, is it really reasonable to just dismiss the story as a scientific impossibility, a complete myth? Or could it be one of history's oldest and most powerful eyewitness accounts of a catastrophe that truly did reshape the ancient world?